I'm like a lot of other people in the United States. I don't watch TV. Actually, I have stopped watching TV about 18 years ago. And I think that in the past 18 years, I've watched TV maybe once or twice. And that was it. So where do I get my information? Well, about 5, 6 years ago, I started to watch podcasts. At first, I was just watching YouTube and watching a lot of videos on YouTube, but little by little, I realized that some people were much better than others because they have much better information, because it was better presented, because they had better facts, or because they met my expectation. So now in 2026, I'm regularly listening and watching to at least 20 podcasts on a very regular basis. And what I want to do in this video is telling you what are my 10 best podcasters for 2026. If you have an other opinion on what do you listen to or what do you watch, let me know in the comment below. And let's start from number 10 to the number 1. So let's start immediately with the number 10, which is Rick Beato. Rick Beato has a music-focused podcast. He is actually a musician, producer, and educator, and explains why songs are worth it or not, and this regardless of their popularity. Rick regularly invites musicians, creators, and thinkers to explore music, creativity, production, and ideas across different styles of music and industry perspectives. Rick Beato has a deep experience in music theory, songwriting, and production, and he uses his knowledge for long conversations that dig into how music works, what influences it, and how industry trends are evolving. And Rick's deep knowledge in music is really what interests me, because he has decades of experience as a producer, is a multi-instrumentalist and educator, and he brings depth and credibility to conversations about music and production. When he interviews people, that's musicians, critics, and industry figures that keep the discussion varied and insightful. Of course, I love Rick's idea. Of course, I love the way he explains why a song is a good song or a bad song, regardless if that song is a hit or not. The number 9 on my list is Neil deGrasse Tyson. So, of course, as you can imagine, I'm the product of the 60s. I was there when Gemini and Apollo space program were out, and I was glued to my black and white TV when the first human put foot on the moon. I was in awe at the time. And of course, when Neil deGrasse Tyson started his podcast, Star Talk Radio, I had to listen to it. So Neil deGrasse is a science and culture podcaster that blends astronomy, physics, and cosmology with humor, which is something that I love, and pop culture conversations alongside comedians, celebrity, and expert guests. The purpose of the podcast is to make complex scientific ideas accessible and entertaining to a broad audience by exploring topics from the universe origin to everyday science questions. So why is it that I love it? Well, I love Neil deGrasse charisma and the show blend of humor, pop culture, and expert insight, because those make big ideas understandable for non-scientists. I like the way he has very engaging guests, and those guests are scientists, entertainers, and thinkers, which offer a very wide perspective on science and its relation to society. So now, the con of the podcast is Neil has a very large knowledge, and when he's interviewing people, sometimes he asks a question and he's not waiting for the answer. He has to stop and say something about what just said. And sometimes I'd like to scream at my screen and say, Neil, let him talk. Let him finish what he's talking about. But it's one of my top 10 lists, and that's the one that I will recommend if you like space exploration. you should go and watch it. So the number 8 on my list is Patrick Bet-David. So Patrick is an Iranian that has been brought to the US when he was 7 or 8 years old. And since then, he's been a very famous entrepreneur. So Patrick Bet-David, or PBD as everybody knows it, has a blog that features conversations on business, entrepreneurship, of course, current events, politics, sports, and culture, often with commentary from his hometown and high-profile guests. So let's talk a little bit about the hometown boys. There's one guy who's called Vinny, which is the one that I really don't like about the podcast. So I like PBD as a person, but some of these hometown boys, and especially Vinny, soil the podcast because Vinny has a vision like this of the world. In his world, everything should be between those two very small points, and whatever Patrick is saying, he always comes back to his convictions and doesn't want to hear about anything else. So that's the only problem that I have with the PPD podcast. But it's still one of my favorite podcasts, and you should listen to it. It's called PBD, and it's number 8 on my list. My number 7 podcast is Brian Tyler Cohen, and the podcast is called No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, which at the beginning was a weekly political podcast. Now he's broadcasting every day and sometimes several times every day. So Brian Tyler Cohen covers major and breaking political news. He's featuring a lot of interviews with politicians, strategists, lawyers, and policy experts directly involved in current US politics. The show presents political development, analysis, and insider perspective without, that's what he says, bad faith, talking point, disinformation, or lies. So what do I like about Brian Tyler Cohen podcast? Well, he has a timely political coverage. Every episode is talking about what is going on right now or at the time of the podcast in the United States, let's say 90% of the time, and the rest of the world, let's say 10% of the time. He has invitees who are very knowledgeable, especially in law and politics. So the podcast has a very strong ratings and regular updates, and it maintains a polished format and a loyal audience. That is to say, his podcast is very professional. And that's why I recommend Brian Tyler Cohen is number 7 on my list of my 10 favorite podcasts that I listen to very regularly. The number 6 on my favorite top 10 podcasts for 2026 is Scott Galloway. So Scott Galloway is an entrepreneur, is a professor and author of several books, and he offers a sharp analysis and commentary on business, markets, politics, and culture with a mix of weekly segments and expert interviews. The podcast covers everything from entrepreneurship and career advice to economic trends, geopolitical issues, and current events across several theme shows under the Prof G Media Network. So what I like about Scott Galloway's podcast is that he's very knowledgeable, he has very good arguments, and it's very difficult to counterattack his argument. Hence, you should agree with him. What I don't like about his podcast is most of the time, the first 10 minutes of his podcast is talking about himself, where he has been, how much money he has made, and the fact that he loves money, is an investor, and he says it all the time, every time. He's making a lot of money on investments and is absolutely not ashamed about that. And that's one thing that I don't like about Scott Galloway is that for him, everything turns around money. If you don't talk about money, then you don't have the right to exist or you don't have the right to be in our country. Because the United States is a place where you need to make money. If you don't make money in the United States, according to Scott, then you will not be able to make money in any other place in the world. But having said that, Scott Galloway is still one of my favorite podcaster, and he has ranking number 6 on my list of the 10 best podcasts for 2026, and you should listen to him. We are on the way to my number 1 podcast for 2026, and we are now stopping at number 5, which is Ezra Klein. So Ezra is the only journalist of my list, and when I say journalist, that's because he has a column every week on the New York Times. Of course, whatever subject he writes on the New York Times is also part of his podcast. He's doing regular interview and analysis that explore major political, social, economic, and cultural issues through long-form conversations with experts, writers, and thinkers. He talks about climate change, democracy, economic policy, identity, and the future of the United States and the society in general with nuance and in-depth, and his podcast is always connecting current events to broader ideas. So what I like about Ezra is, of course, when he's interviewing someone or when he's doing his own podcast, he's always putting forward his own ideas, but he's also willing to understand the other side and understand why the other side is thinking what they are thinking and what are the other side's solution for the problem he's talking about. So he's someone who is quite open to diversity, opinion, and very open. Number 4 on my countdown is Peter Diamandis. So Peter Diamandis has a podcast that's called Moonshot. It's a technological and innovation podcast that explores how exponential technology will shape the future of humanity. On his podcast, Peter Diamandis talks about meta trends, big tech, solar power, artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, nanotech, 3D printing, synthetic biology, etc., etc. His podcast is a libertarian paradise. He's viewing the future world as free to build whatever you want with no rules, no constraint, no tax. And of course, he's trying to spread the ideas of Peter Thiel. There should be no constraint, no tax, no government, and people should be able to create their own company without any constraint from anybody and make as much money as possible. And that's one of the problems that I see with the podcast. He looks at the future and he sees a bright, extremely positive future. The word that he uses all the time, maybe 50 times in all his podcasts, is the word abundance. He's saying that because of artificial intelligence, we are going to enter in a world of abundance. So I think that, maybe for some people, maybe the people that are on the top, the people that are investing in their artificial intelligence, for them, it's going to be a period of abundance. But for the rest of us, people who will be out of the work, where is going to be the abundance? So the way he's presenting his podcast, and the way I understand it, is there's going to be this very small class of people on the top for which life is going to be absolutely amazing. Billionaires. They're going to have so much money that they won't know what to do with their money. And there's going to be the rest of us, 80% or 90% of the population will have no money and we will not be able to live or even to survive. So I love to watch Peter Diamandis' podcast because it looks to me that's one of the people that's absolutely out of touch with the rest of us. I think he doesn't understand what's going on with the world. For him, the future will be so bright that there's not going to be any other way around it. It's going to be a future with artificial intelligence, or there's going to be no future. That said, he is very knowledgeable and he has a lot of information on emerging technologies and future trends that inspire long-term thinking and innovation. He has a lot of high-profile guests who provide diverse expertise and perspectives, making episodes rich in information and ideas. So if you're interested in artificial intelligence, you should watch Peter Diamandis' podcast, with a caveat that to me is too much positive. It looks like for him, artificial intelligence is so great that we should let the dogs out and see what is going to happen. And for him, what's going to happen is a world of abundance. That said, you should listen to Peter's podcast because he's the number 4 on my list. Now, the number 3 podcast of my top 10 list of podcasts for 2026. And that rank number 3 is for Steven Bartlett. So Steven Bartlett is a British entrepreneur that explores mindset, success, personal growth, leadership, business strategy, and life lesson with a wide array of influential figures and experts. So the podcast aims to offer motivational insights and real-world stories to help listeners think differently about achievement, resilience, and self-development. Now, remember what I said about Neil deGrasse Tyson? He asked a question, and even before the interviewee has not finished answering, he stops everything and he gives his point of view about the question he just asked. Well, Steven Bartlett is exactly the contrary, and that's why I love him. He asks a question and he waits patiently, sometimes up to 10 minutes, for the person to answer and to take his time and to explore all the arguments about what he's going to say. I love that style of interviewing because those podcasts are not constrained by time. The podcast from Steven Bartlett can last 2 hours, 3 hours, even sometimes more than 3 hours, but it's so full of very good information and insights and arguments that it's worth your time. So a little trick that I have, and I think that everybody has, is I never watch the podcast at a regular speed. I usually go to 1.5, sometimes 175, and even sometimes when I really understand everything and it's like, wow, super interesting for me, I watch that at 2, which for a podcast of 3 hours reduce the time to 1 hour and a half, which is very nice and I love it very much. So on my list of the 10 best podcasts for 2026 is number 3, Steven Bartlett. Okay, now we are on the top 2, number 2 and number 1. And let's start with my number 2 best podcast for 2026. And that's Tom Bilyeu. So in my list of the top 10 best podcasts for 2026, more than 60% are about the economy and politics. And of course, Tom Bilyeu is not an exception. It's a rule. So Tom Bilyeu's podcast is about economics and politics. Tom is an entrepreneur and he likes to break down big ideas from personal development and mindset to geopolitics, economics, future technology, and cultural trends. So the idea of the podcast is to help listeners understand and think more clearly about real-world complexity and how to thrive in a disruptive era. Because that's what's going around in 2026 in the United States and all around the world. The world is in a complete disruption. Whatever was happening or whatever was going on in the past 60 years is now obsolete, and a lot of people are scared because even though the past is not good enough, we still don't know what the future will be made of. And that's why Tom's Byler podcast is very good, because he combines interviews with experts and deep dive to challenge conventional thinking and guide audiences to a higher performance and understanding. So what I like about Tom's podcast is he asks a lot of questions. He's trying to understand what is the problem about. He lays down all the arguments of why we have this problem, and I think that's very good. Now, on top of that, he's giving answers and solutions to the problem he's just talked about. All the problems that he's talking about, I agree with him. Now, sometimes on the solutions, I'm not entirely agree with him, but that's why I like to listen to him, because I'm really interested not only with the solutions that I think I have and which I think are the best, but also with other people's solution. And sometimes I think that other people's solutions, which were not my solution on the first place, make me think, you know what? Maybe I'm going to change my ideas. So Tom Byler is the number one podcaster on my list of the 10 best podcasts for 2026. So that's it. From number 10 to number 2, those are the favorite podcasts that I'm listening or watching on YouTube on a regular basis. But there are also some podcasts that I think are very good, but they didn't make the top 10 for a couple of reasons. So one of the podcasts that I'm listening and watching, but not on regular basis, is the one from David Pakman, because I think it's about the same as Brian Tyler Cohen. And since it's very similar, I prefer to watch Brian Cohen. The second one would be Piers Morgan. So the problem with Piers Morgan is, for a very long time I was watching him, and then I realized that he's baiting people. It's an entertainment podcast. What he's doing, he has a theme and he's inviting two people from one side and two people from the opposite side. And at the end, everybody's arguing, everybody's talking over each other, and it's more a spectacle of how things should not work, and it doesn't add anything. So I still from time to time watch Piers Morgan, but I've stopped watching him because of this, because it's a spectacle, because it's entertainment, and because his podcast is only a rage baiting. The third one would be by Lex Fridman. So I think Lex Fridman has a very good podcast, but again, there are other podcasts that are most probably exactly the same content. And because I don't have enough space, because I've decided to include only 10 podcasts, I couldn't include Lex Fridman into this list. And I think people like Stephen Bartlett or Tim Billier are doing the same job, and probably just a little bit better. And that's it for the 3 people that didn't make the top 10, but that I recommend you to watch or listen, because I think that's good enough podcasts. So now, let's go on with my favorite podcast. Now the number one podcast, and the number one podcast is for someone who's called Max. No last name. And maybe you're going to understand why Max is not giving his last name. His podcast is called UNFTR, Unfuck the Republic. So what Max is doing is trying to understand how the US is working, what are the problems of the US. He's trying to uncover things that nobody is talking about, explaining how those things are bound together, and why and how those things happened in the United States. And because the United States is the most powerful country in the world, whatever we do here in the United States has a repercussion, sometimes positive, but according to Max, most of the time negative to the rest of the world. So we don't know a lot about Max, but when I listen to his podcast, I know he has a very good knowledge in economics. My guess is he probably has a master or even maybe a PhD in economics, maybe in political science. And when he speaks about something, you can be sure that it's been argumented way before by a lot of other different people, and he has the arguments to convince that what he's saying and what he's talking about is the right stuff. So his discourse is really a disruption of conventional wisdom, and because of that, his analysis of US politics, socio-economic policy, history, and current events are top-notch. The podcast blends historical context, and that's what I like about Max, that he's not talking about what's happening right now, but he's trying to tell you, hey guys, you know what? What we are living right now, we already did it 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago. And this is what happened when we did it. And this is why maybe we want to think about it twice before going on and keep on doing what we are doing right now, because we know that in the past we did it and we had very negative consequences. So Max topics are inequality, labor rights, climate change, and corporate power. Now, all those podcasts that I listen are all about oligarch and how and why the oligarchs are really the ones that are running our country, and maybe most probably that are running the world. And maybe we should limit the power of the oligarchs in the United States. Remember when I was talking about Peter Diamandis, I was talking about Peter Thiel and his idea that there should be no constraint to whatever a company can do, no labor law, no environmental law, no taxes, and the right to do whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do, and how you want to do it, and how much money you're gonna make by doing whatever you are doing without any constraint at all, especially trying to set up free trade zone in a country that we are inviting: Venezuela, Greenland, Gaza, Ukraine, or any small island in the Pacific. This is a real problem. Those infiltrated companies that have no constraint are really a problem for us in the United States, for the economy of the United States, and for the rest of the world. And in my opinion, that's what Max with UNFTR is talking about. So that's it. That's my list of the 10 best podcasts for 2026. I hope you like them. I hope you're going to listen to them, or at least to a couple of them. And if you have any comment, if you didn't like one of those podcasts, or if you think that I'm missing a big one that I should listen to, let me know in the comments below. And I see you on the next video. Bye-bye.